This is podcast number 3, the $4 billion Arab loans affair that brought down the dismissal of the Whitlam government. And I'm going to now present to you the overwhelming evidence that the parties behind this were the founders of BCCI. So this is back in 1976. We are tracing the checks, the $4 billion check, and we're now going to look at the overwhelming evidence that it was a CIA MI6 joint sting, and it involved the original founders of BCCI. In this diagram, I'm illustrating to you the things that we've covered in part 1 and part 2. We uncovered that the overwhelming evidence from the testimony of Michael Riconosciuto and the notes of Danny Casolaro that it was Frank Colucci, Ted Shackley, William Colby that organised the sting against Dr. Jim Cairns, the Australian Federal Treasurer, and Gough Whitlam to destroy them, given that they were threatening to shut down Pine Gap. Not only that, it involved Robert Booth Nichols, together with Michael Hand for the Nugan Bank, and also an array of characters, Harry Gillam, Eric C. Cowles, Michael Stevens, and several others in organising the $4 billion Arab loans to destroy the government. Part 2, we showed that the arrangement of that cheque and payment was being orchestrated by a company called Commerce International Corporation, founded by Sonny Facilis. And we showed that it involved Ambassador Marion Smoke, and together with Paul Halliwell and his involvement with CIA and links back to Ted Shackley. But what we're going to show now is there's overwhelming evidence that the evidence that was put into Parliament was the $4 billion loan was orchestrated through the bank, and it was called Mercantile Bank and Trust, registered in the Bahamas. And we'll now look at who the owners are. We're going to show you that it was founded by General George Olmsted, with his links with OSS, with Paul Halliwell, and Castle Bank. And I'm going to prove to you that he also owned Financial General Bank shares, which was renamed First American Bank shares, and the owners of that was Jackson Stevens, ARMMAND, and also together with sold to Saudi Arabian investors, particularly Kamal Adam, Hassan al-Bedi from Pakistan, and the key suspect involved in setting up the murder of Daniel Casolaro was the checks that he had from BCCI written to Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gulnafar, financed by the chairman of Kuwait Airlines, Faisal Al-FULAIJ. And also the other owner was Gaith Farhan. And these were the secret owners of what would become BCCI. And of course, the evidence shows from previous podcasts the motives for killing Danny Casolaro is that he was meeting with Robert Altman, who reluctantly agreed to meet with him in Martinsburg because Danny Casolaro was in communications with Jack Blum and the Senator Kerry's BCCI investigation, given that he had the smoking gun. The BCCI signed checks and through the Monte Carlo branches of BCCI. So let's have a look at the journey, and I'll show you the overwhelming evidence that back in 1976, the parties, the octopus that Danny Casolaro was investigating, was all involved with the dismissal of Gough Whitlam's government in Australia, the October Surprise, the Iran-Contra, BCCI, and the theft of the Promus software. So let's take you on a journey on going back to 1976, the evidence that was being released to the media to embarrass Dr. Jim Cairns and Gough Whitlam, forcing their dismissal. To make the point known that it was Danny Casolaro, the first chapter was covering the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, the $4 billion Arab loans affair. He wanted to investigate Nugan Bank, October surprise, the links with Wackenhut, Cabazon Arms and Cabazon Casino, Fidco, the link of Robert Booth Nichols, Robert Mayhew, George Pender and Clint Murchison. He wanted to also meet with the Royal Commissioners for the Costigan Royal Commission that were investigating the links of drugs, arms and money laundering through the Painters and Dockers Union with the shipping companies that were bringing the drugs and arms in, linked back to Nugan Bank and particularly Robert Booth Nichols. He was investigating the BCCI, Iran-Contra arms and drugs scheme for money laundering, and he also had the damaging memos exposing Oliver North together with CIA, Mossad and French intelligence agents who were brokering a $2.5 billion brokers of death arms with Iraq. And also he had the damaging customs report from New York, the Indochina report, which was exposing the links of Earl Bryan and also Solomon Schwartz, a Mossad agent, George Oakham, who was a former US Navy SEAL, and also bodyguard for the Gambino Mafia, involved in the shipment of arms and drugs through containers in Kuwait, coming back from Desert Storm. And of course, the theft of Promise software from Inslaw Inc., which was then modified for Swift banking at Wackenhut by Michael Riconosciuto and put in at Citibank for Project Hammer, and also unproved that it's CIA Operation Steel Point. So let's take you on the journey. Podcast 1 exposed the parties involved with setting up the $4 billion Arab loans affair to destroy Jim Cairns and Gough Whitlam, and we've covered that. It was orchestrated and authorised by President Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, with William Colby, Ted Shackley, Frank Colucci, and it was designed to embarrass and the forced resignation of Jim Cairns. Michael, in part 2 of my podcast, confirms that he was working directly with Sir William Dennis Kendall, a former MI6 spy and renowned success in obtaining information against the Nazis when he was sleeping with the mistresses of the Nazi officers. It was him who orchestrated the sting with MI6. He confirms that he was with William Dennis Kendall at his house when he was speaking directly with British Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the Queen, and they gave him permission to proceed with the joint CIA MI6 intelligence sting to destroy the Whitlam government. That was podcast number 2, part 2 of the dismissal of the Whitlam government. As you can see, it was condoned by MI6 and CIA with the blessing of Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger and Harold Wilson, UK Prime Minister with Queen Elizabeth. They're the parties involved. We've proved beyond doubt the evidence of that operation to bring down the government of Australia in 1976. We showed in that podcast that it was done through Commerce International, founded by Sonny Facilis, together with William Donovan, Paul Halliwell, and orchestrated with William Colby, William Casey, with Paul Halliwell playing a prominent role in setting up Nugan Bank, BCCI, and also involved with Castle Bank. We'll show that also he was involved heavily with Mercantile Bank and Trust Company, and we have presented the evidence that was put into Parliament that the $4 billion loan was authorised through the directors of Mercantile Bank and Trust Company, registered in the Bahamas, linked to Castle Bank and Trust Company, and clearly it was a CIA operation of Paul Halliwell, together with his links with Ted Shackley and Michael Hand. You will see previously that the links of Paul Halliwell were direct with Frank Nugent, Michael Hand, Ted Shackley, and also Thomas Clines. His operations were directly for laundering the drugs through the Golden Triangle and laundering the proceeds of those through the Nugent Hand Bank. This is the evidence that was presented in Parliament and released to the media. Clearly the Mercantile Bank and Trust Company in the Bahamas authorising a $4.2 billion loan to the Australian government, and it's signed by the directors Robert Corden and Robert Lightbourne. Now those names, we're now going to prove to you that these transactions taking place in 1976, what was going on worldwide with these people and this bank at the same time that wasn't reported in the Australian media. And we're going to show you that they're involved in huge land deals with billionaire Daniel Ludwig, particularly the secret purchases of Walt Disney's World land in Florida scandal. This is all happening at the same time, and I'm going to show you that Daniel Ludwig was the purchaser of that, represented by Paul Halliwell, and also owned Ocean Shores in Australia, estate acquisitions that employed Michael Hand, Patricia Swan, and Kermit Bud King, a CIA pilot that's flying all the drugs in to Australia to be laundered through Nugent Hand Bank. Patricia Swan is then employed as the personal assistant to Frank Nugent and Michael Hand. And this is the key part, is it's a major property development in Australia involving Pat Boone, the actor Pat Boone, the Christian gospel singer. And I'm going to show you that this Mercantile Bank and Trust was owned and founded by General George OLMSTED, who owned International Bank of Washington and Financial General Bankshares, which was renamed First American Bankshares, the secret ownership of the BCCI founders, represented by attorneys Clark Clifford and Robert Altman. And I'm going to show you that it's Jackson Stevens with Systematics, who's the secret owner of it, selling it to them with General OLMSTED, together with ARMMAND, who owned Occidental Petroleum, and he's linked directly to all the parties involved with P2 Lodge, Robert Calvi, Banca Ambrosiana. So let's now take you on that journey. Other things I'd like to show you is that the common auditor of Nugent Hand Bank was also the auditor of Mercantile Bank and Trust, and also the auditor of BCCI. So you have the common auditor who's giving clearance on all of the bank money laundering operations of drugs and arms for CIA. And I'll prove to you that at the same time that this is collapsing, Mercantile Bank Trust is forced into liquidation. Immediately following the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, mysteriously KPMG is appointed as the auditor and liquidator of Mercantile Bank. And 50 years later, they release a liquidation report with all the damaging evidence to show that it was the same parties who were really involved in the dismissal of Gough Whitlam with CIA. So have a look at This, we've got the surnames again, and the directors' names, Robert Corden and Robert Lightbourne. Let's have a look what happened at the same time as Gough Whitlam's being destroyed. Well, there's a grand jury going on in the USA, August 25th, 1976, at exactly the same time that Mercantile Bank and Trust letter is released to the Parliament of Australia and the media to disgrace and destroy the democratically elected Whitlam government. And here is a press release. Grand jury may question buyers of land for Disney World complex. And who's negotiating all of these secret land deals for Walt Disney? Paul HELLIWELL. And he's acting on behalf of the billionaire Daniel Ludwig, and confirms that he's involved with Mercantile Bank and Trust. All these transactions are being done through Mercantile Bank and Trust. So whilst the Australian Parliament is using this evidence being tabled with the media to destroy Gough Whitlam, the same evidence is being investigated for CIA money laundering operations of drugs and arms and land deals with Paul HELLIWELL and the Mercantile Bank and Trust, with the same property developer who employed Michael Hand when he first came to Australia. And look at this. We have the attorney representing these land deals is the name Robert R. Hendry, representative of Mercantile Bank and Trust, Georgetown, Cayman Islands, and also a Richard Mark, who also represented Mercantile Bank. And it will prove to you that Robert Hendry worked for Paul HELLIWELL's legal firm. Over here, we have a link of a US IRS investigation taking place at the same time as this evidence is being used to destroy a democratically elected Whitlam government, Dr. Jim Cairns and Gough Whitlam, and the media is not looking at the fact that they are tied up in fraud. And so as we go through, you will see here that Robert Hendry, representative of Mercantile Bank and Trust, and Richard Mark. This part's very important because it's a web involving Paul HELLIWELL. This is a scandal. It's the same parties who employed Michael Hand when he came to Australia. It's the same CIA operation, Mercantile Bank and Trust. The evidence has been used to destroy the Whitlam government. And it says HELLIWELL also was a former counsel to the Mercantile Bank and Trust, Bahamas. Isn't this interesting? I then did a search on Robert Hendry, and I found in the registry for Florida he was also a director of Mercantile Limited in Florida, and there's his name, Robert Hendry, and guess who his partner is? Robert Cords, the president and signatory on the letter down here, Robert Cords. There it is. This is the same Robert Cords as the evidence has been used for the Mercantile Bank and Trust Company Limited letter to destroy the democratically elected Whitlam government. This was not exposed by the media or the Australian Federal Police or the Australian Secret Service, ASIO. This was obvious that it's the same parties. And so when we look at in 1976, Paul HELLIWELL it's showing that he really is directly involved in everything to do with these transactions with Castle Bank and Trust, Mercantile Trust, and represented the big deals for Walt Disney Production that was under investigation. And as you can see, he's linked to Mercantile Bank and Trust, Castle Bank and Trust, one of the founders of setting up Nugan Bank and using that as the CIA bank. And he's linked across with General Olmsted, who is the owner of Financial General Bank Shares, the original bank of BCCI, sold to the Arabs. So let's now look at the evidence that came out later. The Crimes of Patriots, written by Jonathan Whitney. It says quite clearly that after arriving in Australia, Hand went to work selling development lots along the Australian coast 500 miles north of Sydney, and it involves major investments and cash that he gets his hands on in order to found the Nugan Bank. And he's working for Pat Boone, a blonde, goody-two white buckskin shoe Christian revivalist singer with toothpaste ad smile, the money to develop real estate on Boone's good name. And yes, it involved Daniel Ludwig, the reclusive multi-billionaire shipping magnate. Ludwig's operations were managed by a lawyer by the name of Fred Miller, and he works with Sir Peter Abels, Rupert Murdoch's longtime business partner, and also employed Bernie Houghton. So we've got both Michael Hand and Bernie Houghton arriving from overseas and quickly landed real estate jobs tied to the same millionaire crowd that was politically supportive of US hardline foreign policies. Ludwig advanced money to some Americans whose name he doesn't remember. The company went bust. Ludwig had to take over. So we've got all these mysterious attorneys from Washington turning up with Michael Hand and Bernie Houghton. And then it shows that Paul Stoker, now an Everett, Washington lawyer, was running the operation originally known as Ocean Shores. And yes, he's founded this and set it up with his school classmate Boone, Pat Boone, and Boone was enthusiastic enough to fly to Australia, and it launched this new venture. It says, but Stocker says not enough money came in to repay Ludwig, who he says took over the development from him in 1970. And then servicemen who brought property say the names of both Boone and Ludwig were used heavily in the promotions. And Stocker says Michael Hand came aboard through a buddy, Kermit L. Bud King, a former CIA pilot in Southeast Asia. And they were selling real estate. We have the same links to Paul Halliwell. And so as you go through this, you'll see that they also employed Patricia Swan of Sydney, Australia. And she soon became, if she wasn't already, the private secretary administrative assistant of Frank Nugan. She was eventually committed for trial, indicted for helping rape and destroy Nugan files in the days after his death. Records, however, show that in 1969, Hand formed a company called Australian and Pacific Holdings Limited, which announced it would develop an island off Australia's renowned Barrier Reef. Hand did this with two other men, otherwise unidentified fellow named Clive Wilfred Lucas and John J. Foley, a lawyer from Little Griffith, the family home of Frank Nugan. And this is where they cross paths. So, we now have definitive proof that at the same time, the evidence from Mercantile Bank and Trust being tabled in Parliament in the media as evidence of the $4 billion Arab loan that involves CIA and MI6, with the endorsement of the Prime Minister of UK, Harold Wilson, then the Queen, and Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger, together with William Colby, Frank Colucci, and Ted Shackley, using the mafia link of Robert Booth Nichols to implement this, with Harry Gillam, Eric C. Cowles, and Sir Dennis Kendall. And Michael Stevens, group captain, who flies across into France, living in France, to meet with Dr. Jim Cairns to encourage him to take this loan. Supported also by the US Ambassador, Marion Smoke, acting as a consultant to Commerce International. So we have a definitive trail of all of Paul Halliwell's land dealings in the US, Disney World and Ocean Shores with Daniel Ludwig, and the employment of Michael Hand, Patricia Swan, and Bernie Houghton. So we have now the web common auditors, Pricewaterhouse, across Nugenham Bank, Mercantile Bank and Trust, and BCCI. So it turns out that in May 1977, DC owned Bahamas Bank closing for irregularities. So the bank that provides the evidence to destroy the Whitlam government is being shut down. And so that causes a major problem. And so we find that the real owner of Mercantile Bank and Trust Company in the Bahamas is General George Olmsted. He's the owner and founder of International Bank of Washington and the owner of Mercantile Bank and Trust Company Limited. And it says that Mercantile Bank is being shut down due to irregularities. It's not really a bank, it's an insurance company, and he's going to be forced to sell it because of illegal tax dodges for wealthy and money launderings of the underworld. And it confirms that the auditor is Pricewaterhouse and Company, independent accountants for the Bahamas Bank before and after International Bank's acquisition, and then they were also forced to withdraw its opinion on the bank's financial statements for the last 4 years. You will find that it also refused to sign off on Nugenham Bank's transactions in 1979 because they were from Bahamas, the same accountants. This is not reported in Australia by the media or the police or Parliament. Whilst the scandal is erupting in 1976 and allegations that CIA was involved in destroying the Whitlam government. We then find later on in 1982 that banker Frank Nugen in the final days faced a charge of fraud, but his violent death came as no surprise to his associates, and his partner Michael Hand disappears. And it says, a problem with Pricewaterhouse. The other problem probably waiting on Frank Nugen's mind on the night of January 26 was the refusal of Pricewaterhouse & Co.'s Bahamas office to sign Nugenham Bank's books for the year ended June 30, 1979. The Bahaman office covers the Cayman Islands, where the bank had legal headquarters because of the soft regulatory climate there. Mr. Hill had taken the books to the Caymans in October 1979. The local Pricewaterhouse partners had approved the books for the 2 previous years, but this time there was a new Pricewaterhouse auditor on hand. So we had a crisis going at that particular time. The IRS in the USA is investigating the irregularities of Mercantile Bank and Trust, whose auditors are Pricewaterhouse, and they're refusing to sign off the books, and at the same time they're also refusing to sign off on Frank Nugan's books and eventually leading to his death and the disappearance of Michael Hand and Patricia Swan destroying all of the bank records with Michael Hand. We now have the smoking gun. Now this is the most amazing evidence I just found. Mercantile Bank and Trust Company Limited went into liquidation on the 17th of August 1977. The auditors, Price Waterhouse, are removed and the new liquidator appointed is KPMG. What I find amazing about this is KPMG are the auditors of Project Hammer for CIA at Citibank. And their liquidation report, started in August 1977, is not tabled and released publicly until the 13th of April 2023. This is amazing. It's almost 50 years late. And what do I find in the official report? It's only been reported this year, released this year, after hearings on the 10th of August 2023 with liquidation and major cases of litigation. And there it is, confirming that on the 28th of November, KPMG partners in the Bahamas are appointed as the official liquidator. The original liquidators, partnerships, are partners of KPMG, stepped down, and a new sole liquidator is appointed in 1991. And here is the report. I've recovered the report. There it is, dated 13th of April 2023 this year. And there's your evidence. The owner is the International Bank of Washington, which is General George OLMSTED. And there it is. The directors are Robert Cords and Robert Lightbourne. Also, you can see quite clearly George OLMSTED, and one of the original owners is Gordon Mossfold, another shipping magnate. Let's go back to the damaging letters. Here's the evidence that's tabled in Parliament, in the front pages of the newspaper, as evidence to show that Jim Cairns, Gough Whitlam, had orchestrated and agreed a $4 billion loan from a bank that has reportedly irregularities, under investigation by IRS, linked to and owned by Paul Halliwell and General OLMSTED. And there's the signatures of Robert Cords and Robert Lightbourne. This was not highlighted by the media in Australia or the authorities investigating the fraud. So now let's look at who General OLMSTED really is. And there it is. He was a Major General. He died in 1998, was an American military officer and insurance executive. He founded the International Bank of Washington. In 1955, he purchased Financial General Bank shares. Now, those people who know about Financial General Bank shares, that was the bank purchased by the Arabs secretly as the owners of BCCI and First American Bank, with Robert Altman and Clark Clifford. And then it says in 1972 he bought 2/3 stake in Mercantile Bank and Trust Company, the bank that provides the $4.2 billion Arab loan to destroy the Whitlam government. And according to an audit by Pricewaterhouse, Mercantile had transferred about $2 million in assets and liabilities just prior to IBA's takeover of its $26 million to Castle Bank and Trust, the bank founded by Paul Halliwell. And Castle Bank fell under investigation during, and here we are, the IRS investigation, Operation Tradewinds, which had begun in 1965 due to suspected drug trafficking. So the bank that provides the credit as proof to destroy the Whitlam government is the same bank used by CIA for money laundering drugs. With Paul Halliwell, General OLMSTED, and they own First General Bank shares, which we will now have a look at. And so Castle Bank had been under investigation by Project Haven, 300 Castle clients supposedly involved in tax evasion schemes. Halliwell's Castle Bank was revealed to be a CIA account for the Halliwell law firm. And Halliwell supposedly being one of the paymasters for the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba in 1961. Castle had been one of CIA's financing channels for the operations in Latin America against Cuba between 1964 and 1975, which included CIA operatives located in Andros Island, Bahamas. And in 1966, following years of criticism for other banks, the Federal Reserve ruled that Financial General Bank or bank shares was a bank holding company and as such could not be owned by International Bank, by General OLMSTED. General OLMSTED was ordered to sell off Financial General Bank by 1978. It eventually went to a group of Arab investors who were actually nominees for Bank of Credit and Commerce International. This group changed Financial General Bank shares name to First American Bank Shares, which would remain a secret subsidiary of BCCI until later being shut down in 1991 when Danny Casolaro is found dead. And so who are the owners of Financial General Bank shares? It's General George OLMSTED. Bert Lance then plays the facilitator for the sale. It's owned with Jackson Stevens and ARMMAND. Now this is very, very important. One of the first potential buyers of OLMSTED approached was Bert Lance, who had purchased control of National Bank of Georgia from Financial General Bank shares in 1975. A year before Whitlam's destroyed. Bert Lance and William Middendorf, the former Secretary of the Navy, was using $1 million of his own funds to buy 80,000 shares of Financial General Bank shares. Middendorf recruited 20 other investors who put up another $14 million. It was a diverse crew. There was Jackson Stevens, a publicity-shy Little Rock banker regarded as one of the richest men in America who put up $3 million. Stevens wanted to collect on a promise that a computer company he controlled called Systematics Inc. would get a shot at Financial General Bank shares data processing business. There was George Piera, a Swiss banker, invested another $3 million, but ARMMAND, chairman of Occidental Petroleum, put in another $1 million, as did Washington attorney Eugene Metzger, New York investor Thomas Wyman, and the North Carolina National Bank. Now the key names are Jackson Stevens and ARMMAND. This is critical. I uncovered definitive evidence, which I'll do in another podcast, that ARMMAND got his contracts for oil in Libya and Iran through his business deals with Hans Albert Kunz. And here is evidence that there was a lawsuit initiated by Hans Albert Kunz seeking payments for opening the doors for his sales with the Libyan government, Gaddafi, for the Libyan oil interests in 1985. But this part, you will find that Robert Calvi, God's banker, for Banca Ambrosiana, he flew to London on a plane that had been chartered by the same Hans Kunz, who'd been a player in Stitbam's Guns for Drugs operations. The Austrian businessman had involved in providing Exocet missiles for use by Argentine military junta in the Falklands War. The order had been placed by Jelly, the P2 Lodge. The funding had been provided by Banca Ambrosiana through a Vatican dummy corporation in Panama. We are talking about Banca Ambrosiana links with one of the directors. This is crucial. I'll do a whole podcast on Hans Kunz, who is a fascist, P2 Lodge, but isn't it interesting that he's the business partner of one of the founders of BCCI? And in evidence, Elio Chialoni gave testimony in the ENI scandal and the Bologna station bombing about Hans Albert Kunz. He says that Robert Calvi was smuggled into Austria where he hid with Kleinsberg sisters, lovers of Carboni and Vito. From there, Calvi moved to Switzerland where he was helped by Hans Kunz, described in recent PBS Frontline program on Calvi as a Swiss businessman. Actually, Kunz and his brother Albert were associates of Diottolavi, the mobster, and business partners of Cal Coffer, a notorious drug trafficker murdered in prison. The Kunz brothers, Colfer and Balducci, were all part of the enormous Guns for Drugs ring busted late in 1982. And this part's important. It was Hans Kunz who chartered the plane that flew Calvi to London as a favour to Carboni. It was also Kunz who chartered a small plane from Geneva to Gatwick Airport on June 18, the day Calvi was found dead under Blackfriars Bridge. We are talking about the mafia and CIA money laundering of drugs and arms through Banca Ambrosiana and the Vatican Bank. This is a definitive link that hasn't been exposed. The Italian police suspect that it contained the secret dossiers that Calvi kept with him, the briefcase that he took with him to London, at all times for protection, papers of explosive political and financial importance. Previous podcasts I've shown you that Alexander Haig was intimately linked to Mikhail Sindona, Robert Calvi, Paul Masinkas, John Gambino, and the attorney Ralph Seligman. In the Bahamas, a 33rd degree Mason and an attorney for Banca Ambrosiana Overseas Limited. In previous podcasts, I showed that Mikhail Sindona had written to President Reagan threatening to subpoena Alexander Haig to give testimony that everything he was doing involving arms and drugs for CIA was orchestrated by Alexander Haig. And the records show that Banca Ambrosiana, the directors were Mikhail Sindona, Robert Calvi, Paul Masinkas, and their attorney was Ralph Seligman, who owned Commodore International in the Bahamas and Canada with Alexander Haig. And this is the link back to John Gambino, the CIA money laundering operation of Banca Ambrosiana for the drugs and arms through New York with the Gambino Mafia linked to Robert Burt Nichols. And you will find that Lyndon LaRoche had put out quite a bit in terms of the links of Vernon Walters, the Deputy Director of CIA, and their links with Environmental Systems Inc. and gun running operations involving Sir Jimmy Goldsmith, Guatemala oil operation, and together with Robert Calvi and the Banco Ambrosiano. And Vernon Walters as the roving ambassador to the Vatican, and it was he and Alexander Haig that dispatched to Italy the emergency errand of retrieving the fugitive P2 Grand Master Lucio Gelli and the incriminating documents proving that Haig's advisor Michael Ledeen was involved in P2's direction of terrorism in Italy. Previous podcasts have clearly shown for Le Cercle that it involved Vernon Walters, William Wilson as the ambassador to the Vatican, Alexander Haig, Michael Ledeen with Ted Shackley, together with Lucio Gelli, Mikhail Sindona, Robert Calvi, Paul Masinkas, and Carlo Presenti, and also Otto Habsburg, all in the name of fighting communism, with Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, and Brzezinski. This is the link definitively back to one of the directors, Armand Hammer, the original owner of Financial General Bank sold to the Arabs. He was a owner together with Jackson Stevens and Systematics, with the evidence of him being involved with the Promus software stolen from Inslaw, used in BCCI. And now we have a link with George Olmsted, and together with his bank, Mercantile Bank and Trust, with Paul Halliwell, they provided all that evidence to destroy the democratically elected Whitlam government, Gough Whitlam, and destroyed the Federal Treasurer of Australia, Dr. Jim Cairns. So all these investigations of drugs and arms with US authorities goes unnoticed in Australia. And so you will find that in the book A Spy for All Seasons, even Dwayne Claridge, who's posted across running the operations for CIA in Rome, is his best friends are Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig, and confirms the relationship of all three of them involved with the Iran-Contra arms deal with the BCCI checks that Danny Casolaro has as evidence in Martinsburg. And so we now have a definitive link to the evidence that Danny Casolaro was investigating, and his first chapter was on the dismissal of the Gough Whitlam government. He knew the octopus was the same octopus. Previous podcasts have shown the motives for killing him is that it involves the payments to Gorbanafar with the meetings of Ted Shackley and Michael Ledeen with Lieutenant Oliver North, and those 1 million check and 4 million check. These are the checks that Danny Casolaro had as evidence, and it's the motive for killing him. And just to summarise, in 2004, Robert Booth Nichols comes to Australia to threaten my life, advising me that he owned the Baron of Beef restaurant. It was used as a safe house for CIA and Mafia during the Nugan Bank. My podcast on the Mystery Stakemen confirms all that. But at the end of, after saying that I'm upsetting some powerful Israeli businessmen, I'll get a crowbar to the back of the head, and if I continue, I'll have the military coming down on me. He says all your problems in Australia lead directly to Alexander Haig. And the only reason he said that is I had uncovered the link of Alexander Haig with the directors of Banca Ambrosiana through their attorney. And so now we have overwhelming evidence. The evidence tabled in Parliament, the $4 billion loan, was an elaborate CIA MI6 sting. The payments and negotiations done with Commerce International Corporation and Mercantile Bank and Trust leads to the founders and owners of BCCI. And the most important thing is the trail goes back to Nugan Bank, and that independently confirms the testimony of Michael Riconosciuto that it was Robert Booth Nichols, Frank Colucci, Ted Shackley, and Dennis Kendall, using Harry Gillam, Eric C. Cowles, and Michael Stevens, Ambassador Marion Smoke, and Sonny Facilis's company, and General OLMSTED's company with Paul Halliwell, orchestrated the removal of the Gough Whitlam government because they were threatening to shut down Pine Gap. They were also upset about the carpet bombing of civilians in Vietnam, and also the planned invasion by CIA, Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, with Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger for East Timor. I'll do that as a separate definitive podcast. So let's have a look at what was happening with BCCI. Okay, so now we know that the founders and owners were General Olmsted, Jackson Stevens, and then they sold it to Al-Bedi, Kamal Adam, and more importantly, Faisal Saud Al-FULAIJ, who financed those BCCI checks that Danny Casolaro had as the former chairman of Kuwait Airlines, the secret owners of BCCI. Financial General Bank shares renamed the appropriate first bank shares. So here we have confirmation that they're the owners, and the key evidence that Danny Casolaro understands is it's the same octopus. I found in Danny Casolaro's notes that he was investigating land sales of Disney World. I believe he was onto the octopus. It was the same group that destroyed the Whitlam government. Here in 1980, it shows that Financial General Bankshares Inc. is sold across to Sheikh Kamal Adam, Faisal Saud Al-FULAIJ, and represented by Clark Clifford, negotiated with Bert Lance, and involves Jackson Stevens and ARMMAND Hammer. So we have independently verified the research of Danny Casolaro and the testimony of Michael Riconosciuto, written on letters to me from prison beginning in 2004, and ongoing letters and recorded interviews with Michael showing that it was Sir Dennis Kendall who was on the telephone direct with the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, and the Queen to have the clear green light for a joint MI6 CIA sting to bring down the Whitlam government. and this is how they did it. And so Danny Casolaro is hot on the trail of the land sales involving Disney World. He's got the checks for BCCI. He's got the confirmation that involves Harry Gillen and Eric Cowles, Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, Frank Gallucci. And it's the same parties that are all involved with the laundering of drugs through Nugenham Bank, BCCI. In 1991, August 9th, the day before Danny Casolaro is found dead, this was the cover-up of BCCI. The identities of the recipients of those loans were Sheikh Khalid Mahfouz and the Gokul brothers of Pakistan, Faisal Saud Al-FULAIJ, a Kuwait businessman and BCCI bank official who was once president of Kuwait Airlines. Mr. FULAIJ, chairman of Kuwait International Finance Company, received $112.9 million in loans from BCCI and $35 million of loans from Cayman Islands. The Price Waterhouse report said the loans were not being repaid. And A.R. Khalil, whose identity has raised questions among investigators. He received one of the most mysterious BCCI loans, $150.3 million, much of which used to purchase shares of First American Bank shares. This is the day before Danny Casolaro is found dead. In June 10th, 1982, Middle Eastern controlled corporation that holds a majority interest in Washington-based Financial General Bankshares has initiated final steps to convert Financial General into a privately held subsidiary. And it shows that FGB Holding Corp, which owns 96% of Financial General, has proposed a merger. Common stock. Robert Altman, a Washington lawyer who is director and president of FGB, said the proposal offers unique and exceedingly attractive investment opportunity for Financial General's remaining public shareholders and marks the final steps of our acquisition program. And shows that FGB is a Virginia corporation wholly owned subsidiary of Credit and Commerce American Investments BV in a Netherlands corporation wholly owned by Credit and Commerce American Holdings NV, a Netherlands Antilles corporation. Financial General Bankshares is the holding company of First American Banks of District of Maryland and Virginia, and the Middle Eastern investors began buying stock in Financial General in 1977, 1 year after destroying the Whitlam government. And there it is, the day before Danny Casolaro is found dead. BCCI secretly owned by a bank run by DC lawyers, Clark Clifford and Robert Altman. And the affidavit and testimony of William Turner is that Robert Altman had agreed reluctantly to meet with Danny Casolaro in Martinsburg because he was threatening to give his BCCI evidence of the signed BCCI checks to Adnan Khashoggi and manager Gurbanifar for $1 and $4 million, and the transactions up to $17 million of BCCI through the Monte Carlo branch directly to Senator Kerry's BCCI investigation committee. And I have proven in my podcast the telephone records of Danny Casolaro clearly show that he was calling twice the home telephone number of Jack Blum. So we now have definitive proof that the owner of Mercantile Bank and Trust was General OLMSTED, and he also was the owner of Financial General Bank that was sold to the secret owners of BCCI in 1977. It involved Jackson Stevens and Sheikh Kamal Adam, Faisal AL-FULAIJ. This is the definitive link of the octopus that Danny Casolaro was exposing, went back to the days of Gough Whitlam's dismissal. It was the same CIA octopus involved in everything from Whitlam's dismissal, the $4 billion Arab loan, October surprise, Iran-Contra, BCCI, and the theft of Inslaw's Promus software for Swift banking, put in at Citibank for Project Hammer and for BCCI, and later proven to be used by Leo Wanta for CIA Operation Steel Point for all the money laundering operations of Citibank and the Bank of New York and the Antigua banks, Minitap Bank and the European Union Bank. On July 1991, Clark Clifford, Robert Altman were indicted together with Gay Ferron, Faisal Saud Al-FULAIJ, Aga Hassan Al-Bidi, Kamal Adam, that they had defrauded the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and were bribing heads of governments, central banks in Argentina, Peru, Nigeria, and it also bribed officials, African Development Bank of 4 other African countries. This is 4 weeks before Danny Casolaro is found dead and his briefcase of evidence is missing. So this diagram clearly summarizes the trail of podcasts number 1, 2, and 3 of the definitive evidence that it was the same octopus that was involved in the dismissal of the democratically Whitlam government. And if you follow through with Jackson Stevens and ARMMAND Hamer, you are getting to Banca Ambrosiana direct through Robert Calvi, Michelle Sindona, and Paul Masinkas. And you're also getting to Citibank with the Promus software that was installed. I have all the evidence of Systematics was contracted to do the software development for Transaction Technologies and Citibank Singapore, where Michael Riconosciuto testified in court. He had modified the Promus software for Swift banking, and it was put in at Transaction Technologies, a subsidiary of Citibank, for all Swift banking. I'll finish on the note, you can only money launder through all these banks if you've got a willing auditor. It was Price Waterhouse at Nugenham Bank, Mercantile Bank and Trust, and BCCI. And then they're removed, and in 1977 KPMG is the liquidator. And surprise, surprise, they're also the accountant for CIA's Project Hammer at Citibank with A.B. Krongard, using the Promus software. And the report, the liquidation report, is kept under wraps for 50 years after, almost 50 years after the signatories of the letter that destroyed the Gough Whitlam government are clearly the directors of Mercantile Bank and Trust, was the owner George Olmsted, Paul HELLIWELL, and the letter written by the directors of Mercantile Bank and Trust are all tied up in fraud and IRS investigations of money laundering for the wealthy and drugs with Castle Bank and the Walt Disney World secret deals with Daniel Ludwig in Florida and Australia employing Michael Hand, Bernie Houghton, and Patricia Swan, who move across to Nugan Bank. And the rest is history. So, the evidence that Danny had was clearly a threat to the Kuwait royal family because Faisal Saud Al-FULAIJ was directly linked and representing the investments of the Crown Prince and royal family of Kuwait. He was not only a director of BCCI, Financial General Bank, Capcom, KIFCO, and ATOC Oil identified as money laundering all of Noriega's drugs. The evidence that we presented in previous podcasts, the motives, was that Robert Sensi, who worked for Faisal Al-FULAIJ, William Wilson for the Vatican Bank, William Casey, Robert Gray, and Clint Murchison, who's on the board of FITCO with Robert Booth Nichols, Robert Mayhew, George Pender. These are all the parties involved with CIA, with the Kuwait royal family, Banca Ambrosiana, Nugan Bank, BCCI. There's the checks that were never provided as evidence by FBI, Martinsburg Police, or the US Department of Justice with the Zipperstein investigation that clearly was the evidence that Senator Kerry was demanding of Robert Altman to provide. My podcasts show that I rang the same telephone numbers that Danny Casolaro had on his telephone record bills, and Jack Blum answered. It's his home number, and clearly confirms that if Danny Casolaro was going to Martinsburg to meet with Robert Altman and he had copies of the BCCI check signed by Adna Khashoggi in his briefcase, were they ever provided to him? And the answer is no. Do you think Danny Casolaro was in danger having copies of these signed BCCI checks with him in Martinsburg? And Jack Blum's replies, if Danny was down in Virginia in CIA territory and waving all those checks around, what did he think would happen? In Australia, with the collapse of BCCI, there are the front page confirmation of BCCI Australia involved with money laundering of drugs through Australia, and the article even goes on to say that the audit report shows that they were using false names taken from telephone books and transactions from Kuwait for all these fictitious accounts. All roads for the money laundering are leading to Kuwait. It also confirms that Price Waterhouse was refusing to sign off on Nugan bank records in 1979 and also refusing to sign off on 4-year records of Mercantile Bank and Trust. Clearly, the money laundering of drugs and arms and accounts for CIA. And there it is, the chapters that Danny wanted to put into his book. The dismissal of Whitlam, $4 billion Arab loans affair, 1975. Isn't it interesting that that was his first chapter to expose the octopus? Then it was Nugan Bank, October surprise. There are links with Wackenhut, Cabs on Arms, Cabs on Casino, FITCO, Costigan Royal Commission of Drugs and Arms Money Laundering by CIA, Nugan Bank, Robert Booth Nichols, BCCI, Iran-Contra Arms and Drugs, 2 billion brokers of death arms and drugs deal memos that he has that implicates the links of Oliver North with the drug barons working with Noriega, and also the detailed Indochina report of smuggling heroin in containers back from Kuwait, from Desert Storm with the Gambino Mafia, involving Earl Bryan, Solomon Schwartz, Mossad agent, and arms deals and sales worldwide, and involved with CIA, with the 2.5 billion brokers of death, and George Oaken a bodyguard, former US Navy SEAL for the Gambino Mafia, and more importantly, the theft of Inslaw's Promus software modified for Swiss banking at Wackenhut by Michael Riconosciuto and put in at Transaction Technologies, the subsidiary of Citibank, for Project Hammer, and later proven to be CIA Operation Stillpoint with Leo Wanta. Previous podcasts show that I've interviewed the daughter of Albert V. Carone, the bagman for CIA and the Gambino, from Nugenham Bank money laundering as paymaster. She confirms categorically that Robert Mayhew arranged for her to meet with Ted Shackley. Ted Shackley confirmed he knew her father, and he paid for the tombstone, as you can see above there, for Colonel Albert V. Carone. She also says that she received threatening telephone calls from Richard Armitage warning her to remain silent about all matters involving her father. She clearly confirms that Frank Nugan and Michael Hand were friends with her father. Nugenham Bank, it was used in Hong Kong area to launder different monies, and there was General Leroy Manor was involved. Also confirms General Stilwell was involved. A man by the name of Paul HELLIWELL was involved. It was an operation where drug monies in different accounts from certain people were absconded with. One through Nugenham Bank, and they were used for operations that were not sanctioned by the US government, i.e. black operations, and the drug monies that they used for cocaine trafficking. While my father knew Frank Nugan and Michael Hand, I might get mixed up, but I think it was Michael Hand that he knew from the Bronx area of New York. If I'm not mistaken, he was in special forces or in the military at one time. The other link that Danny Casolaro had is that he was investigating the evidence of Daniel Sheehan with the Christic Institute. And Daniel Sheehan confirms that he had telephone calls from Danny Casolaro, and I found in Danny's notes and the transcripts for this book written to the publisher was citing the evidence that Daniel Sheehan and the Christic Institute had exposed with the link of Richard Secord secretly smuggled large suitcases money from opium sales in Laos to Australian Bank, the Nugenham Bank, and also the sales of weapons and illicit drugs. The evidence is clear. We have the definitive money trail, corporate trail, cross-linking directorates. Follow the money and the company links to the evidence to destroy the Gough Whitlam government, and you find the names of Bernie Houghton, Michael Hand, and of course Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, and Richard Secord. This is incredible. I'll do another podcast where I'll show you that it was Thomas Clines who was buying the Nugenham Bank in 1979 with the president of Nicaragua, and was also running the death squads in Indonesia for CIA to exterminate communist sympathizers for the East Timorese. We will provide the definitive evidence of that link, and that was the fourth motive for destroying Gough Whitlam and Jim Cairns, is that Prime Minister Gough Whitlam was publicly raising serious concerns about an invasion of East Timor at United Nations and calling for a peaceful transition where the people of East Timor can decide their own future. He was a thorn in the side of Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger, who had sanctioned the CIA operations of Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, to run the death squads and lead the invasion. And we have now the proof that Thomas Kleins, while doing that, was also later planning to purchase the Nugan Bank with the president of Nicaragua. My evidence on the Nugan Bank is now showing the trail of Robert Booth Nichols with his links with Wackenhut, Armtech in Wackenhut with Paul Zukowski, and also Armtech Limited in Australia for his machine gun and guns that he's selling as part of as part of Nagaramba arms deals to Indonesia, Philippines and Kuwait through Australia, with a major investment scandal linked to the mafia, drugs and heroin deals being exposed by the FBI to the Australian Federal Police. And Michael Riconosciuto, together with Paul Marasca, were involved in mining operations with Mining Resources with Michael Hand, Frank Nugan, Jeff Stokes, and also Southern Goldfields with Jeffrey Stokes and Peter Briggs. We have the definitive records on this, and the money laundering operations linked back to the Gambino Mafia. All transactions of arms and drugs and gold bullion through Nugan Bank with mining companies and the Perth Mint. It was linked across to Task Force 157 with Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Thomas Kleins throughout 1974 through to 1983. And of course you've got the Gambino Casino, John Nichols, together with Thomas Marsden as the major investor of the Cabazon Casino for money laundering. And Meridian Arms, where Robert Booth Nichols is providing his G77 submachine gun with sales to Kuwait, the Kuwait government, the Australian government, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia. So summary for the final wrap-up. When I interviewed Michael Riconosciuto in letters he wrote to me and in recorded interviews later, I was the personal friend of Sir William Dennis Kendall. I was working with him on many secret R&D projects. He was a famous MI6 spy, undercover as a double agent for Winston Churchill during the World War II, and he was sleeping with the mistresses of Nazi officers in order to gather intelligence. During my interviews with Michael, through letters from prison and also recorded telephone interviews with him repeatedly, he has confirmed that he was with Sir William Dennis Kendall at his house in the United States when he was on the telephone speaking directly to the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson and the Queen, and they gave him permission to proceed with the joint CIA MI6 intelligence sting to destroy the Whitlam government. And so when you follow the evidence, the independent testimony of Michael Riconosciuto, who knew Ted Shackley, who knew Harry Gillam, who knew Sir Dennis Kendall, who knew William Colby, Frank Colucci, Michael Hand, Robert Booth Nichols, the overwhelming evidence is that the Whitlam government of Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns were destroyed through trickery and fraud, fraudulent letters of credit released to the media, Parliament to be tabled as definitive evidence of secret loans, was done by a fraudulent bank, Mercantile Bank and Trust, owned by poor HELLIWELL and General George OLMSTED, and the owners and founders of BCCI. It all started when Michael Riconosciuto advised Danny Casolaro that Frank Gallucci and Robert Booth Nichols with CIA and MI6 agents orchestrated the $4 billion Arab loans affair to destroy the Whitlam government in 1975. And that was the starting point for Danny Casolaro's investigation of the octopus. He understood that the octopus was behind all of these scandals. And as he was chasing the evidence right up to the last day when he's in Martinsburg to meet with Robert Altman with the checks, they knew that he had put all the pieces together. And so my investigation of the evidence, the records of Danny Casolaro, the testimony of Michael Riconosciuto, the corporate records, the courts, the government records of Australia, the government records of US, it is now obvious that Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns were destroyed by a joint CIA MI6 sting with banks and companies involved in laundering drugs and arms through Australia with Nugenham Bank, through the Bahamas with Castle Bank, Mercantile Bank and Trust, and BCCI. And it all leads, when you follow the evidence, to Project Hammer at Citibank, known as CIA Project Hammer, that moved the funds of Nugenham Bank and Banca Ambrosiana, as testified by General Earl Cockey in his testimony 10 days before he dies. And it was operated by A.B. Krongard, who became the executive director of CIA. And so I dedicate this last podcast that has put all the pieces together of the octopus involved with all the components of the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, the October Surprise, Iran-Contra, BCCI, and the theft of Inslaw's software to be modified as Swift banking software installed at Citibank for Project Hammer and CIA Operation Still Point, to the memory of Danny Casolaro.